Good evening and welcome to Chicago Tonight. I'm Paris Schutz.
And I'm Brandis Friedman. On the show tonight, a preview of President Biden's State of the Union address as tensions are high in Ukraine.
Meanwhile, more than 500,000 refugees have fled Ukraine. We have the latest on Russia's invasion.
Anyone in a car is a potential victim.
Washington turns its eye toward the spike in carjackings.
We are now on day 2 of the mask requirement being lifted.
A look at where COVID-19 mitigations from the state and CDC stand.
We had 20 missiles and 20 warheads.
Chicago was once home to nearly 24 Nike missile bases. What the sites look like today in an all-new Ask Jeffrey.
These aren't mainstream histories, and maybe someday they will be.
A podcast series explores the LGBTQ archives of the Gerber Hart Library.
And so the fillings are going to be much like that of a Colombian punch cube.
And just in time for Fat Tuesday, find out what happens when Poland's most famous pastry meets tropical Colombian flavors. But first, some of today's top stories. Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky receives a standing ovation after making an emotional appeal to the European Parliament.
We are fighting for our rights, for our freedoms, for life, for our life. And now we're fighting for survival. So do prove that you are with us, and then life will win over death, and light will win over darkness. Glory be to Ukraine.
And this comes a day after Zelensky officially asked for the European Union to urgently admit Ukraine as the country resists Russia's invading forces. We'll have more on the crisis in Ukraine later in the program. Illinois' top public health official announces she's stepping down. Dr. Ngozi Ezike has led the Illinois Department of Public Health for more than 3 years, and for the past 2, she's been the public face of the state's response to the COVID pandemic, delivering public health updates alongside Governor J.B. Pritzker 160 times. At a news conference today, an emotional Ezike said serving in this role has been the pinnacle of her career so far.
I have no announcements at all in terms of what the next steps are. The next steps are to finish out these next couple of weeks and try to effect a seamless transition, to be able to step away from the role, try to reconnect with self and family, and just catch a breather.
Dr. Ezike's last day is set for March 14th. The current assistant director of IDPH, Amal Tokars, will serve as interim director while the search for a permanent replacement takes place. Former U.S. Secretary of Education Arne Duncan will not be running for mayor against Lori Lightfoot in the 2023 election. Duncan, who previously served as President Barack Obama's education secretary, as well as the CEO of Chicago Public Schools, said in a statement, quote, "After a lot of thought, I have decided I will not be running for mayor, but will work with anyone serious about making our city safer." Duncan currently runs Chicago Cred, a nonprofit focused on violence prevention. And homicides in Chicago are on pace to match 2021, one of the city's deadliest years in the past quarter century. The Chicago Police Department says it's recorded 92 homicides in the first 2 months of 2022. That's one more than the city recorded through the first 2 months of 2021, a year that ended with nearly 800 homicides. The 43 homicides last month tied for the third highest total for any February in Chicago in the past 25 years. The total number of shootings recorded in January and February was 331. That's down 6% over the same period last year. Up next, what we might expect in President Biden's first State of the Union address. Stay with us.
Chicago Tonight is made possible in part by Alexandra and John Nichols, the Jim and Kay Mabey family, the Polk Brothers Foundation, and the support of these donors.
In about an hour, President Joe Biden is set to give his first State of the Union address. At home, Biden faces an approval rating hovering around 40% and Americans upset over rising inflation despite overall economic growth. All this amid that ongoing crisis in Ukraine. How will the president address these issues, and can he reverse the perceptions of his presidency as Democrats brace for what could be a difficult midterm election? Joining us now with more on the president's address are Jason DeSanto, a political speechwriter and debate strategist for members of Congress in multiple presidential campaigns. He is a senior lecturer at both Northwestern School of Law and Northwestern School of Communication. And Michael Steele, the former chair of the Republican National Committee and the former Republican Lieutenant Governor of Maryland. Welcome, both of you, to Chicago tonight. Jason DeSanto, how much of this speech do you think should focus on the crisis in Ukraine, and what tone do you expect the president to strike on that?
I think a fair amount of it, Paris, has to focus on the issue at hand. These are speeches that take place at one moment in time. They're an opportunity to discuss the past, what's going to come in the future, but they happen right now. And this is what's been dominating people's television screens, social media. It's the big issue, and I think a lot of this speech has to be about it. The tone should be one that is sober. I think that recounts what the president and the administration have done, that builds credibility for the kind of leadership that he's provided, and also offers a bridge into how that same kind of leadership is a contrast, both at home and abroad, on some of the issues that are really going to be pressing for people in terms of the economy.
And Michael Steele, speaking of the economy, the Ukraine crisis might exacerbate some tensions felt here with inflation, the rising cost of gas. How do you expect the president to address these issues?
Well, that's why I think it becomes a little bit more of a challenge for the president, because, while everyone is sort of fixated a little bit on the realities of what Russia's doing, that's not translating into approval for the president. His handling of this crisis so far is not bumping his numbers up. So to Jason's point, while it's important to focus on that, and he will, he still has to bring this back home to the kitchen table, because that's where we're sitting tonight, watching and listening to this speech. So he's got to make it real for us, because, I go out to the grocery store tomorrow, or if I go to fill up my car, I'm going to have a real world experience there. And so he's got to make that understood by the American people that, this is a culmination of events. Dollars that were spent early before he showed up, $8 trillion in spending to sort of deal with COVID and a lot of other things. And now the pressure of this global conflagration in Ukraine, all of this is having an impact on their bottom line. And he has to help them understand not just that, but what he hopes to do about it through his policies through the remainder of the year.
And having an impact on his own approval rating, which, as we said, is hovering around 40%, Jason DeSanto. Historically, does a State of the Union impact the president's approval rating?
Well, it certainly can, because it's an opportunity to speak for sometimes too long of a period of time without being interrupted, to garner a large audience. And particularly in our particular environment now, our communications environment, that's a very unique opportunity. But by the same token, these speeches are so long that often people are not consuming them the way that they consume most of their information these days. It's not in bite-sized pieces necessarily. But he has an opportunity here. To Michael's point, he has the opportunity to speak about economic issues. And I think the point there is to tell a story of progress, to go where people are right now. You cannot convince people that they're in a great economic situation right now. But what you can identify for them is that there has been some progress, and that there are tangible, practical, specific proposals which will help further. And I would take the things from the much larger kaleidoscope of proposals which have been out there and take the ones that are the most middle-class opportunities, things in childcare, for example. Those are the kinds of things that are going to resonate with people. And most importantly, all of this should be within a frame of democracy. And the fact that the point of democracy is so that more people prosper than less, and that power and opportunity are with many, not in the hands of the few. And this is a theme that he's been hitting for a couple of years. The events in Ukraine provide a linchpin, an opportunity to discuss that, but also to provide contrast with what's going on at home, including in that very chamber, because we know what it looks like when a party is enthralled to one person And that's something that Biden has warned about. It's something that Franklin Delano Roosevelt warned about on the eve of conflict in Europe back in 1939 and 1940.
Right, and certainly in an international context, the president sought to make the point that democracy is threatened around the globe by authoritarian leaders like President Putin of Russia. Michael Steele, we'll get to the GOP rebuttal in a minute, but how unusual is it to see at least 3 different Democrats giving their own rebuttals representing different factions of the party?
Well, that's the new norm these days after the speech, where not just the opposition from the other political party, but opposition from within your own political party decides to go out there and lay down what they think the president should have said or what the president should be doing. Look, I kind of get that. I mean, it makes sense. Although I'll be honest with you, I'm from the old school. I just send my speech up to the Capitol and call it a day, because in many respects, this speech has become has more value for opponents, for those who have specific agendas, than to the point you just made, focusing the nation's attention on a very critical piece that may be in front of them, the economy, war, or whatever. And if we're in those types of crises, then yes. So I think at this point, I'm not a big fan of having the rebuttals and the rebuttal to the rebuttal. This is the president's moment to give us his assessment, or hopefully in the future, her assessment of the state of our union. Let them do that without all the political, gadflying. And then Americans can, to Jason's first point, listen soberly, as well as hearing, as the president delivering soberly, the circumstances and the situation we find ourselves in. So I've never been a big fan of the rebuttals by either party, Democrat or Republican, certainly not now the internecine rebuttals from within your own rank and file.
And Jason DeSanto, so much of modern politics is imagery. Is there an impact here of senators like Marco Rubio saying he's not going to be there because he doesn't want to take a COVID test? And there's a few other elected officials following suit.
I don't think so. But I think there is imagery there. And I think the most important image of all is Joe Biden delivering this speech with vigor. We talked a lot, thought a lot about in the past week or so, what is this speech going to entail? How much does it have to be rewritten and recast given what's going on around the world? But a lot of this has to do with Biden appearing to be somebody who's vigorous and on top of it. Some of the most alarming numbers in that poll from the Washington Post and ABC this weekend was not necessarily about the approval rating per se, but about people who just weren't really sure that Joe Biden continued to be up to the task. I think he is, but I think one of the parts of that is describing in a very list-oriented fashion all the steps that have been taken in a prudent, deliberative way to build an alliance. That connotes a certain degree of strength and skill, but also deliver it in a way which is both strong and optimistic. And I think that will have more of an impact than who is or isn't there, and also more of an impact than who is or isn't, to what Michael was saying a moment ago, speaking after him when the audience has dropped off a fair amount.
All right, we're going to have to leave it right there for now. We'll be joined by our guests again later in the program. But for now, our thanks to Jason DeSanto and Michael Steele. Thank you so much.
Mm-hmm.
Carjackings are on the rise, according to the Cook County Sheriff's Office. They've tripled in Chicago over the past decade. Cities including New York City, Philadelphia, and Washington, D.C. have seen similar upticks as well. Senators are now exploring what the federal government can do about it. Amanda Vinicky joins us now with more. Amanda.
Yes, Paris, the roughly 2,000 carjackings here last year amount to one every 4 hours.
So carjacking is a scourge. To be sitting in your car with your family and have a person stick a gun in your face and force you to get out so they can steal the car. That's a situation no American should have to face.
And with carjackers typically armed, it's a particularly dangerous crime.
It happens in a split second. There's a moving car involved. Sometimes there's passengers in the car who are not seen to the perpetrator, including children. That raises the risk that there's going to be some sort of resistance, either by virtue of surprise or by virtue of trying to defend family members from the person who's a victim of the crime. The inclusion of a firearm in that set of circumstances greatly increases the risk of somebody being seriously injured or killed in the course of a carjacking. And we see that over and over and over again.
Experts called before a U.S. Judiciary Committee today point to various reasons behind the surge. With demand high and supply low for used cars, criminals can make a profit from stolen vehicles.
Cars are being stolen here in the United States. There's VIN swaps that are utilized to resell the vehicles, so they're not known that they are stolen. They're shipped overseas, Middle East criminal enterprises. They go outbound. Many of you are aware they were funding for terrorism investigations. And then cars are also shipped to Mexico. We repatriate hundreds of cars a year that are shipped into Mexico after they're stolen.
But also perpetrators may be looking for an anonymous car to use in another crime, like a drive-by shooting. Cook County Sheriff Tom Dart points to that as a common motive. He says that carjackings are easy for the offenders to carry out, but he says that they are hard to solve and hard crimes to prosecute. One issue, it is tough to know the extent due to disparate data. Now, to that end, Senator Durbin is calling on the FBI and the Department of Justice to establish a national database. But also, law enforcement cite issues with accessing vehicle location tracking data in a timely fashion.
I'm a former prosecutor, and I can tell you firsthand, the quicker we can get that vehicle, the less chance it'll be used in another crime, and the more likely we'll be able to convict somebody. The longer it takes, the less likely we can convict anyone.
Dart says that quick access to a car's location is a game changer when it comes to finding the car and catching the culprits. He gives a recent example.
License plate readers. Looking for cars that are on our list because there's warrants for them, they've been stolen, carjacking, so on. By the time the license plate reader hits, though, it's 4 seconds before we get it. They're on the expressway in the Dan Ryan. They're now 5 miles down. We're completely operating in the dark. When it's tracked, we're there right on top of it. When it's not tracked, it's completely random, and we occasionally will get lucky.
Most cars manufactured after 2015 have tracking systems built in, but Dart told senators it is not often clear who to call to access that information. Some auto companies have limited hours, so he says there's no one to call at times when a carjacking occurs and that immediate access is needed. He says that in some cases, companies insist a customer pay a fee to begin tracking their stolen car. Now, in light of these issues, senators are exploring options, like giving U.S. attorneys a greater role.
I'm looking at expanding the reach of federal carjacking statute. Progressive prosecutors at the state level have told criminals that they won't get in trouble with certain crimes. Well, that won't fly with the federal government.
Also, establishing a national standard for when and how law enforcement can access this data. President of the Alliance for Automotive Innovation, that's an auto manufacturers group, though, says that this is a sensitive area. He says that there is not one standard operating system that is used across the board. He also says that car companies have to balance sharing location information with the consumer's privacy rights. He says that companies shouldn't be made to share that data with a third party, even law enforcement, without express consent from the vehicle's owner, unless, well, there are exceptions, unless there is a court order, a warrant, or unless there are exigent circumstances. He says that car owners, however, need to know what exactly circumstances would qualify.
Any case where a vehicle is stolen by force, does it only apply in a circumstance where the theft places the owner or a passenger in imminent danger? At a minimum, we feel there should be a process to certify that there are exigent circumstances.
Dart told senators that privacy concerns are no reason to be paralyzed from moving forward on this. He says that there are ways to overcome those obstacles. Now, Dart, by the way, could face a couple of challengers as he runs for re-election this year. With that, Paris, back to you.
All right, Amanda, thanks very much. And now to Brandis for a recap on the latest COVID-19 developments. Brandis.
In Paris, Cook County is now at the lowest level of COVID-19 risk under new guidance set by the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention. This new framework looks beyond cases and test positivity to determine risk and instead focuses on hospitalizations and hospital capacity. Joining us now with their take are Dr. Susan Bleasdale, Medical Director of Infection Prevention and Control at UI Health, And Dr. Michael Bauer, Medical Director at Northwestern Medicine at Lake Forest Hospital. Thanks to you both for joining us. Dr. Bleasdale, what are the factors that the CDC is now using to determine the risk?
So the factors are not positivity alone, but also hospital capacity. And it's related to the staffed beds that have new admissions. And so it's really, I think, a more interactive, more reliable measure of what's happening in the community and what's putting a strain on the healthcare system. This is similar to what the Chicago Department of Public Health had put forth, is not just using those positivity and new cases, but what's the impact on our healthcare system that has a potential to impact not only patients who are ill with COVID, but the potential to impact patients that are ill with other issues that need care.
Why is the focus on hospitalizations the better metric to use versus case rates?
Well, because right now, thankfully, we have a large number of people that are vaccinated. And we have seen throughout this recent surge and the Omicron surge that people are still protected with vaccination and boosting. And so, you are someone that is young and healthy and vaccinated, it is unlikely that you're going to end up in the hospital. And so the numbers of positives that are overall going to do well, have mild illness, that alone isn't, I think, a factor that impacts how we need to put in mitigation measures. It really has to do with what's our strain on our healthcare system. And I think this new measures that the CDC has put in place is more meaningful in helping us to decide what mitigation strategies we need at different points. And it aligns with what we've done as a state and a city in saying that now masks can be optional for individuals in certain settings based on our transmission rate and our hospital capacities.
And Dr. Bauer, what about your hospital? Are you all still feeling the effects of this recent surge?
Yes, we're also feeling the effects, fortunately, of the precipitous decline. As little as 3 weeks ago, we had over 40 to 50 patients hospitalized with COVID. This morning, we were down to 8 hospitalizations. And I think what these new metrics really help reflect is the level of severity of the disease in the community, because we don't go through all these measures with other infectious outbreaks like flu seasons. So if we can see that the level of severity is now much less and not going to overburden the healthcare system and result in excessive hospitalizations, it's going to allow us to start to pull back on some of the measures like masking.
So to sort of illustrate what the CDC has done, we've got 2 maps to show you. One shows much of the country at high risk for COVID using CDC's old metrics. The other, under the updated system, much of the country is now at low to medium risk. Dr. Bleasdale, has the decrease in COVID, has it been as drastic as this change would seem? How should people look at this and look at this difference?
Well, I think there's 2 factors. There's this new measure, but I think there has been a dramatic decline in the number of patients hospitalized with COVID-19 in the last 2 weeks. Really, it's come down significantly. So I think that it is 2 factors. This new measure that I think is more, at least reflects more what we need to do from a mitigation strategy, and the fact that we have had a rapid decline from a peak in the first week of January.
Now, CDC has also endorsed, had endorsed universal masking in schools since July, but under this new guidance, recommending masking in schools only in counties at high risk. Dr. Bauer, what prompted this adjustment?
Again, now being able to say that areas are low or medium risk and deeming those to be relatively safe for the majority of people that aren't at risk. Because most of our students in pediatric population are not at high risk. There are certainly some that may be, and obviously we want to encourage everyone to get vaccinated and boosted if eligible. But these new metrics allow us to say not only out in public, but even in school, where we know transmission by and large has not been a huge issue from student to student, it's going to allow us to get back to levels where we don't have to wear a mask. Of course, we want to make it a safe environment for students. And if anybody still feels like they want to mask, especially in these next few weeks as everybody adjusts to it. We want to certainly encourage anybody to do that safely for themselves.
Dr. Bauer, are you worried at all that these new guidelines could lead to another surge?
Yeah, I think there's the potential that we may see a bit of a bump, but I for one, am fairly optimistic that we're not going to see that at the current level. I think we need to be very vigilant come fall and next winter and be prepared to go back to layered mitigation, including masks, if we do see a new variant crop up or something else. But at the moment, I don't expect that we're going to see a big bump now.
And to that point, you know, obviously this time last year, the vaccine had just rolled out. Everyone was excited about, you know, sort of a relatively normal summer, and then Delta hit, Omicron shortly after that. Dr. Bleasdale, how concerned are you about a new variant cropping up soon?
Well, you know, I think that there's a subvariant of the Omicron that we're watching closely, and there's a chance that we will see a new variant. But I think that it's important to highlight that Omicron's not gone, and COVID is not gone. And even now with these measures, it isn't no masks. It is masks are optional. And much of this now is a personal decision for many people in many settings about what's their personal risk, because there still may be COVID in the environment, and what is the community transmission. And this will help individuals decide about masking, and this will help us to prevent the next variant if we can keep control in some sense. And then this helps us on when we need to implement more significant mitigation measures as a community, you know, as a school, as was highlighted already, or in a larger setting.
Okay, we'll have to leave it there. My thanks to Dr. Susan Bleasdale and Dr. Michael Bauer for joining us.
Thank you for having us.
Up next, digging into archives full of stories from Chicago's LGBTQ community. Stay with us.
Thousands of Puerto Ricans are taking to the streets to protest massive blackouts.
Over the years, Mexican culture, from food to music, has become woven into the city's tapestry.
Medical professionals share the latest recommendations on COVID-19 booster shots.
DACA recipients have been facing longer delays than normal in their status renewal.
Little Village is one of my favorite neighborhoods. This neighborhood comes together to celebrate such an important day in our culture.
And there's much more ahead on the program, including the latest on Russia's invasion in Ukraine. But first, a library filled with collections of people's stories is coming to life in a new podcast series. Chicago Tonight's Joanna Hernandez heads to the Gerber Hart Library and Archives to meet the people who are unboxing LGBTQ history.
Mark your calendars and make plans to go to Mauston, Wisconsin over Memorial Day weekend. We'll visit CK's Outback, a women-only campground about a half-hour north of Wisconsin Dells.
At the Gerber Hart Library and Archives, you can find anything from old newsletters to costumes. And even a Barbie of Rosie O'Donnell. There's aisles filled with dozens of boxes telling stories of the past.
You know, I do think queer history gets kind of boiled down to Stonewall, AIDS, gay marriage, and like that's it. And there's no conversation about how rich the history is before Stonewall, and there's no conversation about kind of positive moments.
Program coordinator Jen Dentel started as a volunteer 8 years ago and was quickly enchanted by the life of a Chicago drag queen, Miss Tilly.
Look at Miss Tilly, right? I mean, she's got the cat eye, there's fringe, there's gloves, there's so much of the beehive. She was a drag queen 40s. She passed, I believe, in 2005. Her biggest performances were in the 60s and 70s.
Now Miss Tilly's story, among others, is coming to life in a podcast series called Unboxing Queer History.
It's so exciting to see yourself reflected back at you in history. And I mean, I feel that particularly with the Amigas Latinas collection, which was a group that gathered monthly in the late 90s through the early aughts to just be Latina and be queer together and talk about it and bring in their families.
One thing that they were really excited about was the softball team.
Here are some of the actual, hats and uniforms, and just imagine the kind of pride wearing something that has both of these identities.
Audio producer Ariel Mejia pitched the idea to Gerber Hart, and with the help of a grant, it grew into an 8-episode series, each episode diving into the work and lives of activists, performers, and organizations like Transgenesis.
This is an actual journal, and this is a collection that we have many copies of. And yeah, they interviewed the wonderful Lorraine Shelley Baskerville.
Started here in Chicago.
It started here in Chicago up in Edgewater in 1995.
This is her. So cute.
Podcast creators say the series gives LGBTQ trailblazers a voice to unpack their experiences.
The people that we interviewed talking to us about their history and that we were even interested in it was a point of so much emotion for these elders that we talked to. It was incredible.
Film seized in police raid.
Oh, yeah.
1991.
91, they were seizing films.
The group shares discovering their queer lineage has empowered them and hopes listeners feel the same.
Okay, 2000. When you're like, oh, that wasn't that long ago.
22 years. 22 years.
Think about your photos of, you and your friends having fun at a bar. Think about the brochures from the organization you're starting. Your shirts, your hats. These are things that are so important and so valuable, and I hope people realize that just existing is important.
Miss Tilly.
Hope they laugh. I think we've found ways to, bring joy and laughter to the fold, because queer history is a lot of fun. It doesn't only have to be kind of the heartbreak we've had to endure.
Silky gloves.
So I hope they're curious and happy. I hope it feels like a celebration.
I was about to say, curvy girl.
I know. Yeah.
For Chicago Tonight, I'm Joanna Hernandez.
The Gerber Hart Library and Archives has been preserving queer items and collections since 1981. You can head over to our website to learn how you can listen to the podcast. Now, Paris, back to you.
All right, Brandis, thanks a lot. And still to come on Chicago Tonight, a Ukrainian-American journalist joins us to share the latest on the developing situation in Eastern Europe. A look at the themes and messages expected to be emphasized in President Biden's first State of the Union address. Chicago's lakefront used to be home to Nike missile bases. The history behind these sites and what the old military grounds look like today in Ask Jeffrey. And where can you find paczki with a tropical punch? Only in the land of Colombia. We take you there for a taste. But first, some more of today's top stories. Chicago police have been more likely to stop black Chicagoans than white Chicagoans and more likely to use force against them. That's the conclusion of a new report released today by Interim City Inspector General William Marbach. The report audited police stops and use of force from October 2017 through February 2020. It found, quote, strong evidence of race-based disparities and that black Chicagoans were, quote, overwhelmingly disproportionately stopped by Chicago police officers across the city. When a police stop resulted in an officer using force, more than 83% of those incidents involved a black person, according to the report. The United States and allies announced they will release 60 million barrels of oil from the strategic reserves. This as gas prices soar in response to Russia's invasion of Ukraine. Half of that is set to come from U.S. reserves and the rest from allies in Europe and Asia. Benchmark U.S. oil prices today surged to more than $106 a barrel, a 7-year high. According to the American Automobile Association, a gallon of regular gas now costs an average of $4.10 in Chicago, with premium going for $4.89. After being shut for nearly 2 years due to COVID-19, the Adler Planetarium will finally reopen on Friday. Michelle Larson, the Adler's president and CEO, says planetarium staff are, quote, excited to welcome guests back to connect and explore with us in person. During the planetarium's forced closure, a brand new telescope was installed in the Doan Observatory. And according to Larson, it is the largest publicly accessible telescope in the Chicagoland area. Hope may spring eternal for Cubs and Sox fans, but this year, the hope is to have any games at all. Major League Baseball Commissioner Rob Manfred announces the first 2 series of the regular season will be canceled. This after the Major League Players Association rejected MLB's last best and final offer on a labor contract. At issue, among other things, are league minimum salaries and a bonus payment pool. The 2 sides are leaving the table and not expected to return until Thursday at the very earliest. Refugees are fleeing Ukraine by the thousands as Russia appears to have stepped up its attacks. Today, Russian bombs hit several civilian areas, including a building near Ukraine's second largest city, Kharkiv. Ukraine's president declared the attack a war crime and is set to meet with Russian officials again in the coming days. And joining us to discuss this situation abroad is Ukrainian-American journalist Julian Hayda, who claimed residence in Ukraine in January. He's a former producer of WBEZ's Worldview program. Julian Hayda, welcome back. You were last in Ukraine about a month ago. What are you hearing from your contacts on the ground right now?
Well, thanks, Paris, for having me on the show. I'm hearing a lot of uncertainty, and I think it's a pretty fair response. Whereas on Thursday, when bombs started to fall across Ukraine, 1,000 miles across, in cities east and west, north and south, while the indiscriminate nature of the air raids, of the rocket fire, seems to have settled down, and the attacks seem to now focus around more strategic cities. So at first you had kind of like a shock and awe situation that people are still trying to shake off, and people still don't necessarily feel safe wherever they are. Now it is truly, the skies are opening up in places where Russia is trying to make land advances from the north, past Chernobyl into Kyiv, from the south, from Crimea, which has been occupied since 2014, and from the newly recognized by Russia breakaway regions in eastern Ukraine that are also pushing people west, and Kharkiv, which, although having resisted any sort of serious separatist movement over the last 8 years, is nonetheless very close to the Russian border. And so that's the city that we saw attacked this morning in addition to Kyiv. In Kharkiv, 10 people are dead. Imagine it being Grant Park. It's the center of town, right next to a major financial district, right next to some major universities. And it's shocking because many of the attacks so far have been on the outskirts of cities, military installations, infrastructure, and now we're seeing rockets strike the middle of urban centers.
And Julian, so you mentioned Kharkiv, you mentioned Kyiv, a lot of reporting about convoys getting closer to those cities, and you mentioned the horrible air attacks on Kharkiv this morning. Is the consensus that Russia is going to step up its attacks on these cities?
It's hard to say. I mean, the consensus seems to be that Russia wasn't expecting such a strong fight on the part of the Ukrainians, based on Ukrainian numbers. So, again, this is just one side of the conflict, but Ukrainians are managing to have a casualty rate of 1 Ukrainian to 10 Russians. So I don't think anybody on the Russian side was expecting Ukrainians to put up such a fight. 80,000 people, according to Ukraine's government, have entered Ukraine to volunteer in the war effort, the French Foreign Legion. So the fight is ongoing. I think they've predicted Kyiv to fall like 2 or 3 times already, and it hasn't. Granted, it's only been 5 days. So,
well, that's my next question to you, Julian.
Yeah.
They've valiantly held off Russian forces in places like Kyiv. How long do you think Ukrainian forces with these reinforcements can continue to do this, especially knowing the kind of artillery Russian forces have?
Well, what I think a lot of people might be most surprised by is how much this is an air war. So Ukraine has been rather effective with, for example, stopping certain convoys. There was a convoy of 800 Russian vehicles in the south of Ukraine that was destroyed today by Ukraine's Air Force, and Ukraine is now getting Russian or Soviet-made airplanes sent to them by the European Union, which made the very unprecedented step of, as a bloc, providing Ukraine with weapons. So while Ukrainians, I don't think, want this to escalate. They're, I think, properly equipped even today, more than they even were a few days ago. They're fighting for their homes, and that is a lot more compelling than what Russians are fighting for, which is uncertain. Nobody in Russia is really sure what the fight is on about, and Russian media is reporting no casualties or few casualties, although some officials have let slip of their casualties. And yet in cities like St. Petersburg, there are thousands of anti-war demonstrators, and people are getting arrested in droves. So it's really kind of also a war of information and will. That these Russian soldiers aren't sure what to follow and what to
we've heard, Russians shutting down independent, whatever remaining independent media outlets they have, and just sticking with their state-sponsored propaganda. Julian, what are you hearing about the evacuation efforts? We've heard stories of African students there, Middle Eastern students, not being allowed on buses or trains. Tell us about the evacuation effort.
Yeah, I've seen a lot of those painful reports as well. I think there was a great deal of confusion and frankly, lack of preparedness on the side of Ukraine. Again, half the country wasn't really expecting the war to escalate in such a way. And then you had the government of Poland originally extend a kind of a temporary refugee regime with citizens of Ukraine. There are, of course, Ukraine is a very diverse and multi-ethnic country. Afro-Ukrainians have been in Ukraine for over 100 years. So there are Black citizens of Ukraine who have the rights of citizens of Ukraine. And I think the confusion is some of them being profiled with the up to 20,000 African students, exchange students, who don't necessarily have the same civil rights. And a lot of that has led to tragic situations at the border with people being turned away.
Right, we've heard those reports. We have to keep following all this. We'll have you back, Julian, to continue to talk about this. But for now, thank you so much for joining us.
Thanks so much, Paris.
And up next, an all-new edition of Ask Jeffrey, so please stay with us.
Ask Jeffrey is brought to you in part by BMO Harris Bank.
Okay. Can you get this? I don't have my wallet. Oh, really? It's funny how that always happens. Yeah, it's fine.
With BMO Harris, you don't need your wallet. You can get money from any BMO ATM using your phone.
Uh-oh, looks like someone can buy their own tacos. Okay.
You could also pay them back with Zelle.
So many ways for you to pay. Yeah, you know what? I'm not hungry. I'll just have some of yours.
Order for BMO.
Ooh, tacos, banking. Some things are made to be mobile.
That feeling you get when your phone is your wallet. That's the BMO effect.
The Russian invasion of Ukraine may bring back memories of the Cold War. As the U.S. and other countries enact sanctions against Russia for invading Ukraine, a viewer sent us a question about remnants of escalating tensions between the U.S. and the USSR. We dig into that and more in our latest installment of Ask Jeffrey. Jeffrey, welcome back to the studio. We're glad you're here.
Great to be here.
So let's get to that question. It's from John Reese of Chicago, who asks, were intercontinental ballistic missiles ever housed or siloed at Montrose Harbor? If so, are any of the silo structures still there?
Well, our questioner is on the right track. There were no ICBMs or intercontinental ballistic missiles at Montrose Harbor, but there was a Nike missile base there, right there at Montrose Harbor. Nike missiles were defensive weapons. They were the country's first surface-to-air guided missile system, whereas ICBMs were offensive weapons. They were actually what led to Nike missiles becoming obsolete. The U.S. developed the Nike missiles during the Cold War to defend against a new generation of Soviet bombers that were armed with nuclear weapons capable of reaching almost any target in the entire United States.
Wow. So how many of these sites were there around the country?
Well, across the country, there were about 300 Nike missile sites. They were installed in rings around major metropolitan areas and other strategic sites around the country. This was in the early 1950s. In the Chicago area, there were about 20 of them. Montrose Harbor was the radar and command center that controlled a battery of missiles actually located right next door at Belmont Harbor. Another launch facility, it's hard to picture this now, was on the south side in Jackson Park with radar and control right there on Promontory Point. There were also Chicago area sites at Wolf Lake, Fort Sheridan, the Skokie Lagoons, and elsewhere. And these were placed strategically to overlap so that no part of the area would be left unprotected. I actually grew up not far from the Skokie Lagoons, and I'm old enough to remember as a little kid actually seeing the missiles there right in the Skokie Lagoons from time to time. This would be as we drove by on the Edens Expressway. Initially, the United States used Nike Ajax missiles, but the Ajax could only travel about 25 miles, and military leaders felt that was just not far enough to be an effective air defense. The Nike Hercules was Ajax's successor, which could travel up to 90 miles. And the first Nike Hercules in Chicago was at that Belmont Harbor site. The missiles, along with the fuel and waste products, were stored in these sort of large underground kind of basements, big vaults, sometimes many stories deep. And then a large elevator would bring the missiles up to the surface, and the crew members would push the missiles into position. Now, no missiles were actually ever launched in Chicago, but the missile crews would practice bringing them up from underground and pointing them up at the sky, and that's what, as a little kid, you know, we could see from the Edens Expressway right there in the Skokie Lagoons.
Wow. So you also mentioned the intercontinental ballistic missiles led to the end of Nike. How so?
Yes. So Nike was meant to defend against manned aircraft, but by the late 1950s, the Soviet Union shifted its strategy basically because these aircraft were vulnerable to attacks from the Nike missiles. The solution was intercontinental ballistic missiles, or ICBMs. That was at the origin of this question, and those could actually be launched from Soviet soil. So this change eventually made Nike's air defense role obsolete, and U.S. defense dollars were shifted to developing America's own intercontinental ballistic missiles, as well as missile defense systems, and of course also at that time the growing war in Vietnam. The U.S. government began phasing out Nike bases in the mid-1960s amid budget cuts and fully deactivated most of the sites after the Second Strategic Arms Limitation Treaty was signed by the Soviet Union and the U.S. in 1974. And by the way, the U.S. still has an arms limitation treaty with Russia that runs through 2026.
Okay. So did the U.S. install any sites for intercontinental ballistic missiles in the Chicago area?
No, never had that. There was a proposal to install anti-ballistic missiles in suburban Vernon Hills. These would be designed to shoot down incoming ICBMs as part of the national, it was called the Sentinel program. So it's kind of a different defensive weapon than the Nike missiles. But that plan faced a lot of criticism and pushback, both locally and across the country, by public officials and scientists. They were concerned about the missiles' margin of error and the proximity to major cities. Together, the factors could have led to a catastrophic impact if an accident were to occur. There was actually a lawsuit, but before that came to trial, President Nixon announced that the missile program would be scrapped, and so no missiles were ever installed around major cities.
So are there any remnants of the Nike sites still standing?
Well, almost all of these towers and control facilities are gone now, including all traces at Montrose Harbor, to our viewer's question. But some remnants and buildings still stand, including in Wolf Lake, where there is an actual Nike missile on display. This footage, of course, was shot in the summer. Promontory Point's old site is now part of the Lakefront Trail, and Belmont Harbor, same thing. Became kind of a large grassy area. But it should be said that in 1971, before the U.S. government gave up ownership of that site, a few dozen indigenous people occupied it, demanding the government turn the area into public housing and a school for their community. Eventually, they were forcibly removed from Belmont Harbor, and they went on to occupy other former military grounds.
Now, you know, it's nearly 5 decades after the last Nike site closed. Since then, Russia has invaded Ukraine. Can we draw any lessons by recalling that era of Nike missiles in the Cold War arms race?
Well, for one thing, that I remember, it was very, very expensive. And for that and other reasons, the two Cold War superpowers stepped back from the brink, signing that SALT treaty that I mentioned earlier, aimed at limiting production of nuclear-tipped missiles. And of course, the Soviet Union eventually collapsed. I guess all I can say is we can only hope that the world has learned from history as events unfold in Ukraine today.
Yeah, certainly devastating what's happening there. And Jeffrey Baer, good to see you in the studio, always learning something.
Glad to be here.
And don't forget that you can visit our website to submit your own question to Jeffrey Baer. That's at WTTW.com/AskJeffrey. Up next, what happens when a beloved Polish pastry meets tropical Colombian flavors? But first, a look at the weather. In Chicago, today, the last day before Lent, is often called Paczki Day, when Chicagoans indulge in as many of the traditional Polish jam-filled donuts as they can eat. A local couple has brought a tropical punch to Paczki with their unique food fusion concept. Producer Erica Gunderson visited the land of Colombia for the story.
We're gonna grab our beautiful paczki just straight out of the oven.
In the Time Out Market demo kitchen, married restaurateurs Cynthia Orobio and Philippe Sabone are putting the finishing touches.
Okay, so we're gonna make a nice little divot right in there. So where our filling's gonna go in.
On their version of a Fat Tuesday tradition.
It gets every little corner here. This is the guava coconut. It'll have a nice coconut shavings all around.
The smell of paczki in the air is one of the first signs that spring is around the corner in Chicago. And while everyone loves the classic versions of these sweet treats, if you're looking for a little bit more of a tropical flavor this time of year, Colombia is the place.
So paczki essentially is this beautiful fried or baked dough, right? It's a donut pretty much. And then you would have a filling that consists of either marmalade, a custard, sometimes chocolate. And usually the secret ingredient that a lot of people put in, which people don't realize why it's so soft and not heavy and loaded with a lot of goodness, it's the vodka. So there's actually vodka that's put in a lot of the secret recipes.
Polish desserts are not very, very sweet. Colombian are. But I came to realize that what we can do to go ahead and make sure that both of them are resonating with each other is add those tropical fillings like guava, pineapple, wild berry, different things like that, especially caramel as well. It's a very big component in like what is Colombian desserts.
Houston native and nutritionist Orobio moved to Chicago in 2019. She met Sabone, a self-trained chef, at a party.
It was love at first sight, as Cynthia will probably tell you.
I beg to differ.
Not long after their relationship blossomed, the pandemic hit.
I got laid off from my job. We just both started cooking a lot from home, just like everybody else during the pandemic.
The seed of their culinary collaboration was planted when Sabone added Colombian toppings to a Polish zapiekanka, a pizza-like snack.
A thought that was just like, this would be a really cool concept, a Polish-Colombian fusion.
They named the new concept, what else? Colombia. Starting with pop-ups, they began offering fusion foods like the pierogi, a combination of the Colombian empanada and the Polish pierogi.
So what we've done is meld the two, where the inside is going to be much like a Colombian empanada, where you'll find that farmer's cheese, caramelized onion, coffee braised short rib beef, and that potato in there, and the outside looks much like a pierogi.
Now, 2 years and one new Colombian later, the restaurant is going strong inside the Time Out Market. And as pandemic restrictions begin to lift, Orobio and Sabone say they're looking forward to seeing customers' faces when they pick up this year's paczki.
I think the number one thing that we miss the most is to actually see people's reactions, right?
We're hopeful for that, and hopeful to be also bringing Nicolas and have people see Nicolas as well.
For Chicago Tonight, this is Erica Gunderson.
Who's hungry for a paczki? You'll find more on Colombia on our website. Now, Paris, back to you.
Thanks, Brandis. Early in the program, we previewed President Biden's State of the Union address, and now we're joined again by Jason DeSanto and Michael Steele with some final thoughts ahead of the speech. Michael Steele, the president is expected to focus on some things he believes can get bipartisan support going forward amid the failure so far of his Build Back Better agenda. What do you think those items would be?
I think those items are going to touch right on the kitchen tables of America. It's going to impact, childcare. It's going to impact voting. I think it's going to impact the ability for families to move out of this recession, addressing what the president can do to help sort of stem the pressure from inflation. So I think the more he focuses on that economic piece, the more secure people will become in his ability to handle it. Because right now they're not sure. And I think that more than anything else is where he needs to steady the course for a lot of Americans.
And Jason DeSanto, polls show that Biden has lost the most support among independent and Republican leading voters that voted for him. How does he appeal to those voters in this speech?
Well, I think speaking about the issues that Michael outlined a minute ago, prescription drugs, speaking about crime, and speaking also about childcare, those are the kinds of things that cut across and also speak to independence. But the other piece is on the foreign affairs and on the situation with Ukraine, recounting a deliberate, prudent, thoughtful leadership which builds alliances, and begin to contrast that with a go-it-alone approach that we've seen for the past few years, and also to contrast the ability to support somebody like Zelensky, who's inspirational, contrasting that with what happened over the past few years, essentially blackmailing Zelensky. That's the kind of a visceral appeal which will be couched in what's actually happening on the ground with Russian savagery and Ukraine bravery that will appeal to people who are in the middle of the political spectrum. And to your question, Paris, that's where a lot of people are residing right now, and they want answers to those questions.
All right. Well, you gave us a lot of answers to these questions tonight, and our thanks to Jason DeSanto and Michael Steele. Thanks so much.
Thank you.
Thanks, Paris.
And you can watch President Biden's State of the Union address right here on WTTW coming up. And we're back to wrap things up right after this.
Chicago Tonight is made possible in part by Alexandra and John Nichols, the Jim and Kay Mabey family, the Polk Brothers Foundation, and the support of these donors.
And that's our show for this Tuesday night. As we just mentioned, remember to stay tuned now to WTTW for live news hour coverage of the President's State of the Union address from a joint session of Congress. That begins here at 8 o'clock. And now for all of us here at Chicago Tonight, I'm Paris Schutz.
And I'm Brandis Friedman. Thank you for watching. Stay healthy and safe, and have a good night.
Closed captioning is made possible by Robert A. Clifford and Clifford Law Offices, a personal injury law firm dedicated to preserving the dignity and rights of all individuals.